Well, good morning, and thank you so much for joining our webinar today. My name is Nick Defenthaler. I am a partner and senior financial planner with Center for Financial Planning, and I'm excited to chat with you today about a very important topic. It's a not so exciting or fun topic to talk about, but what do I do after a layoff? Unfortunately, in our current economic environment, we're starting to see more and more companies make cuts to their labor force. Most recently, Ford Motor Company here in the Metro Detroit area just announced that they're going to be laying off 3,000 employees. So we're seeing some of these situations and significant life events happen right in our backyard. So I wanted to take the time, as did our firm, to educate, provide resources, and really talk about some of the most timely items that we want to be on clients' radars and on your radar too, if you're unfortunately having to go through this sort of life event and make a career transition. So I thank you once again for taking the time to join us today. Before we dive in, a little bit about Center for Financial Planning. Our team's mission is pretty simple, to do financial planning done right. That's a biggie for us. And so what does that ultimately mean? It means that we want to look at the totality of your financial well-being. Ultimately, does that mean making sure that your cash flow is the way that it should be, taking a look at your investments to make sure that your investment portfolio is well aligned with your goals, your risk tolerance, to ultimately achieve the goals that you have. We also want to be taking a look at your insurance, your estate plan, your income tax. Long story short, we think financial planning done right really encompasses much more than just your investments. Certainly, that's a very important component, but there's a lot of other aspects that we want to be having conversations around and giving you advice on. The center was founded in 1985, so our team has been in existence, and we've had the privilege of serving clients for just shy of 4 decades now. Every single one of our client-facing advisors has a CFP or the Certified Financial Planner designation. It's something we take very seriously. We want all of our lead financial planners, like I said, giving you advice that extends well beyond the investment management. We now have the privilege of also serving over 950 clients, managing over $1.3 billion in assets as well. So we've been doing this for a long time, and we've seen what works, what doesn't work. We've helped hundreds of clients over the years not only navigate being laid off or having a career transition, but retiring or death, divorce, receiving an inheritance. Really some of the most meaningful transitions that you'll experience in life. We have experience and expertise on helping you through those life transitions, if you will. A little bit about me. Like I mentioned earlier, I'm a partner and senior financial planner, director of financial planning here at Center for Financial Planning. Nick Defenthaler. I reside in Brighton with my beautiful wife, 3 kids. I've had the honor and privilege to being a part of the center team for just over 9 years. I started back in 2013. Life was a lot different back then. I was not married, did not have 3 kids or any children for that matter, but I've really found a home here at the center, and becoming a partner in 2020 was a major career accomplishment for me. And I think most importantly, really hammered in that this is where I found a home, that the center is where I want to be. We serve clients the way that I view and I believe that we should be serving clients. So it's been a great journey, and really enjoy doing things like this where we're able to do educational resources or educational speaking and provide resources, I should say, for clients and prospective clients who are going through these significant life events. So a few things that we're going to cover today. I just received news that I'm being laid off. Now what? Can you imagine getting that notice? I'm sure many of us have over the course of our career, know friends or family members who have unfortunately received this not so great news. What do I do if I've ultimately received that news? We're going to cover a few of the top and most important financial planning and investment consideration or concepts that I believe that you should be keeping on the radar both now and after this career transition, and of course talk about additional tools and resources, next steps from here that our team can ultimately help you with. I kind of view this presentation as part 1. You've taken the time to join us today. We're going to give you some great information to walk away with, but ultimately after this session, you're going to receive a few emails from us with additional resources an opportunity to have a one-on-one complimentary conversation or consultation, I should say, to really just answer any specific questions that you have, because we're going to really cover things at a fairly high level today. And everyone's situation is unique. And from what I found in my experience, usually there's one or two things really keeping folks up at night when it comes to their financial plan. So we're here to help you with that, and we're here to have a conversation. So feel free to reach out. Our contact information will be at the end. But so I wanted to tee things up and kind of go over what the session is going to entail today. So let's dive right in. So first and foremost, I think this would be kind of neat to take a trip down memory lane, going back to the year 1992, when gas was a little bit cheaper than it is today, only $1.19 a gallon. Presidential election saw Bill Clinton ultimately win over George H.W. Bush. We all remember Ross Perot. He was a pretty popular, or maybe not so popular when you look at the or lack thereof of electoral votes that he ultimately received, but it was a very interesting and I should say memorable election that ultimately occurred 30 years ago, 1992. We had the Space Shuttle Endeavour ultimately occur in 1992, and Hurricane Andrew, a terrible hurricane that ripped through the coastline, down near Louisiana and Florida. Hundreds of casualties, just a horrible, horrible event. But I'm sure if you can think of those things, think of what you were doing back then, 30 years ago. I know back then I was about the age of my oldest son right now, which is kind of hard to process and think of. But how much life has changed over the course of those 30 years. Things that you've accomplished in your life and twists and turns that you've taken over the course of your personal life, your career, whatever it may be, right? I bring this up because ultimately when folks are laid off, in many cases, not all obviously, but in many cases, it's towards the back half of your career. And that's exactly what we're seeing right now with some layoffs that have occurred here in the Metro Detroit area, most notably, like I mentioned, Ford Motor Company. Many individuals are in their middle to late 50s, sometimes early 60s. So you're contemplating retirement. And so I bring this up because these decisions that you might make right now, if you are ultimately going to decide to retire, are going to impact the next 30 years. So it's a significant decision, and decisions, plural, that you're going to have to make, like I said, that have monumental recourse over the next 3 decades. So I bring this up because it's just hard to think of, 30 years from now, all the different things that have occurred and have changed. Ultimately, at the end of the day, what we want to do for clients, help you make the best decisions with the information that we have at the time that's aligned with the goals and the things that you want to do in retirement, and try to align those things. Your plan is going to change, just like your life has changed over the course of 30 years, but we're going to be with you each and every step of the way to navigate those changes. So you've ultimately received this not so great news that you're being laid off. What do I do now? What's the next step? First and foremost, as difficult as it may seem, pause and take a breath. Pause and take a breath. It's one of the most important, and I'll say best pieces of advice that I think I can give clients when they're going through this transition. It's going to be okay. It might not seem like it at the moment, and that your world might be crashing in, and everything that you've worked hard for, maybe you were with a company for several decades, if not longer, and you receive this unexpected news. It's gut-wrenching, right? Pause and take a breath. Go, if you're able to, go away for the weekend with a spouse or family members or friends. Try to get your mind off of this as much as you can. I know it's much, much easier said than done, but try to seek out ways to have time to yourself, take a breather, and just tell yourself that it's going to be okay. Life throws us curveballs. You'll get through this one just like you have in previous, all the other situations that you've had to encounter and navigate throughout the course of your life. Most importantly, as we start to talk a little bit more about the finances around this major life transition, making sure that your emergency account and your liquid reserves are the way that we ideally want them to be. Now, in a perfect world, we're really making sure these are in place well before you're ever laid off. So an emergency account, in most cases, we want you to have at least 3 to 6 months of cash reserves in place, sometimes even a little bit more than that, depending on the variability of your income. I am a little bit more conservative on the cash reserve side. I prefer to see clients have about 6 months of cash reserves on the sidelines. It does not mean that's what your net 6 months of gross or net earnings. It's whatever your spending is. So really take a close look at that. Obviously, if you've been laid off and your income has stopped, or you're receiving a severance for the next couple months, that could be a good opportunity to really take a look at your budget, your cash flow, making sure that you have significant reserves in place, at least, like I said, 3 to 6 months to ride you out through this time of uncertainty. When you have those things in place, you're just going to feel a little bit better about your situation because you're not worrying quite as much when it comes to the financial side of it. Now is the time, and you're going to have some more free time on your hand, especially if you're not just jumping right back into the workforce. I would really encourage each and every one of you to go through your budget, what you're spending, your credit card statements with a fine-tooth comb and try to trim out as much fat, as I like to call it, as possible. Doesn't mean you need to do that forever, but get lean for the next 3 to 6 months or however long it needs to be. That's going to ultimately make you feel a lot more comfortable as well, that you've done that work, that you've looked at your budget to really identify, hey, here are the things that are great to have when income is coming in the door. But realistically, do I need to stop at Starbucks and get that, $5 or $6 latte each and every day now that I'm not working? I love good coffee. I love going out to eat, things like that. But I mean, the reality is there's sacrifices more than likely going to have to occur during times like this. And hopefully it's very temporary, but getting your spending in line is one of the top priorities that you should have when you do receive this news that you're being laid off or being let go. Some resources to ultimately consider. We have a budget worksheet on our website that I'd be happy to share with anyone if you'd like to reach out to me after the presentation. And like I said, we're going to send a few emails out as additional resources, but the budget worksheet I think is fantastic, where it's not going over each and every single line item. You'll probably drive yourself crazy by doing so, but it's more high level. And I think directionally going through that is always a good thing to make sure that your spending is in line with how much cash and how much in reserves that you ultimately have. If you have issues with making any sort of payments on a mortgage or an auto loan, don't just not make the payment. Contact the lender, let them know what's going on. In many, many cases, they're willing to work with you. Okay. Doesn't mean that the loan's forgiven, but there are situations, and depending on the institution, of course, where you might be able to defer 1 or 2 payments without going through a significant process or overhaul with the loans. Same thing with credit cards. Like I said, every institution is different. So I don't want to talk too much in broad terms, if you will, and tell you that you could definitely, make adjustments on the loan terms. But the point of the matter is be proactive. Call your loan provider if you are really going to struggle to make a payment and see what can be done. It's worth a phone call and a conversation. Healthcare is one of the biggies. If you receive this not so great news that you're being laid off, in many cases, healthcare is ultimately going to continue for a period of time. In many cases, that's part of a severance package or some sort of buyout that you may have received, a buyout offer if you've been laid off or received an offer to ultimately walk away on your own. Healthcare is going to be one of your biggest expenses, both in retirement and when you're going through this sort of transition. If you are getting closer and closer to age 65, that's when Medicare begins, okay? So if you've been laid off, and let's say you're 63 years old and you get this news on the back half of 2022, and you've already had a pretty significant earnings throughout that year. Medicare then, and you decide, let's say hypothetically, that you say, this is a blessing in disguise. I was going to retire a year from now, but actually now this is kind of a sign from above that I'm going to shut it down right now, and I'm going to retire full time. Okay, retire from working full time. Excuse me. You can do what's known as an appeal on your Medicare, because Medicare does this funny thing where they evaluate your income from 2 years prior to ultimately determine what your premiums are going to be when you turn 65 and each year beyond that point. Okay, so hypothetically, let's say you turn 65 in 2024. Medicare is taking a look at your 2022 income to determine what your premiums are going to be when you turn 65. Now, obviously, this is only impacting those who are in their early to mid 60s, but it's a real thing. And unfortunately, right now, from what we're seeing out there in the universe, in many situations, it's your folks in that age group who are getting these notices that they're being let go. One thing that you can do, like I said, because as an example, if you worked a large part of the year in 2022, and now your Medicare is going to begin in 2024, you can file this appeal with Medicare when the time is right to basically tell Medicare, hey, I no longer have earned income. My income when I start Medicare is really going to be things like Social Security. Maybe you have a pension, taking money out of your investment accounts, et cetera. It's going to be much lower than what my earned income or my tax return showed back in 2022. So you can file this appeal. You can also do that, like I said, if you've had a retirement, a death, a divorce in the family, things of that nature that would ultimately qualify for an appeal for Medicare to readjust your premiums. Because as you can see on the chart below, your premiums are based on your income level. So the higher your income is, the higher your premiums, Part B and Part D, are ultimately going to be. So we are not an expert in healthcare planning and all the inner workings of insurance, whether it's individual or Medicare planning. That being said, we have several consultants, both one individually here in the Metro Detroit area, if you prefer to work with a living, breathing person, and have that dialogue, as opposed to one other service that we have directly through Raymond James is having a consultant help you, over the phone and things of that nature. That service works really good for people, especially if you're out of state. But if you do have someone, or if you are listening, you're in state, you want some more information on how our trusted resource can help you out, feel free to reach out and I can connect you guys and ultimately make sure that you're making really quality decisions around healthcare, because like I said, it is going to be one of the biggest expenses that you have, both leading into retirement and post-retirement. Now, like I mentioned earlier, you're more than likely, if you've received a severance, there's going to be some form of continuation of healthcare. Not always, but in many cases there are. And you also might be eligible for COBRA, so that extension, but that's expensive. So talking to a resource where this is something that they do each and every day is highly, highly recommended. Now, we do a lot of work on the income planning side when it comes to healthcare and the coordination of all these things. But at the end of the day, we want to be the quote unquote quarterback of your financial plan and connect you with the right resources, whether it's a healthcare agent, whether it's a CPA, it's an attorney, to make sure that all these other areas that impact your financial well-being are well taken care of. As I mentioned earlier, in regards to having higher income, and that ultimately might be a reason to do an appeal on Medicare. One of the other things that we want to take a look at, if you're charitably inclined, more than likely, in many cases, if you're going to end up retiring after you've received this notice to be, laid off, it could be one of the last years that you're in a very high tax bracket. So one thing that we like to explore with clients who are comfortable doing this sort of strategy, have the resources, and are charitably inclined, is something called front loading your charitable gifts. When the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act was passed in 2017, ultimately went into effect in 2018, the standard deduction amount doubled in size, okay? Without going too deep into the weeds on that for the sake of time, I'll bottom line it for you. About 75% of people prior to the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act going into effect ultimately took the standard deduction, okay? So if you added up things like charitable deductions, property tax, your state and local income tax, all these other things, they did not add up to or exceed that standard deduction amount. Well, now about 93% of Americans take that standard deduction because of how much it's gone up. Like I said, it's more than doubled over time. So in most cases, if you're giving money to charity, whether you realize it or not, you're not getting any economic benefit from it. Now, that's not to say in every situation that's the case, but for 92 or 93% of Americans, it actually is. So what can we be doing to make sure that your charitable goals are met, but also in a perfect world, get you a tax benefit on it. Because like I always share with clients, if we could facilitate your charitable gifts in a tax efficient manner, that ultimately leaves more money in your pocket as opposed to Uncle Sam's, where you can then take that additional money that you saved in taxes and give that away to charity. I've actually done that for some clients to try to quantify, hey, here's the savings. And now that we know, hey, we saved you $3,000 or $4,000 in taxes by doing this the right way, we can now turn around and give that additional money to charity. I actually have a couple clients where we do that for it. I think it's a cool and a really great way of looking at it. So let's bring this all together. How do we do this front loading strategy to kind of bunch charitable contributions all up into 1 or 2 years to get you the most bang for your buck? So let's take a look at Jim and Janet, both age 63, adjusted gross income in 2022 of about $220,000. That puts them into the 24% tax bracket. Okay. In most years, Jim and Janet give about $5,000 a year to charity. But like I mentioned, despite annual gifting, Jim and Janet's deductions, things like their property tax, mortgage interest, charitable gifts, etc., they're not exceeding that standard deduction amount of, I'm going to say, about $26,000 a year. Okay. So that threshold is pretty darn high. Okay. They plan to retire in 2023 with adjusted gross income of about $120,000. So dramatically less than their current adjusted gross income because they're still working. That would put them in the 22% tax bracket, maybe actually pretty darn close to the top end of the 12% bracket, but either way, in a lower bracket than what they're in currently. Okay. So what if we ultimately did the front loading strategy and help them facilitate a larger gift in 1 year to make sure that they exceed that standard deduction in the last year that they're going to be in that 24% tax bracket, excuse me. So how do we do that? Well, in this situation, if we ultimately give a large gift, let's say $50,000, I know that might seem a little crazy because that's significantly more than the $5,000, but stay with me here for a minute. It's 10 times their normal amount that they give to charity. If they have the resources to do that, either through cash or through where we typically see this is a client gifting either cash or appreciated stock, mutual funds, bonds in their after-tax investment account. Okay, that's another great strategy that I'll touch on here in a second. You can give funds from that account or from cash to ultimately give that to charity. Okay, so 50,000, 10 times the normal amount that they would typically give. All right. What is that doing? That's pushing them well above and beyond that standard deduction amount. So they're now receiving the economic benefit of giving those funds to charity, because because that charitable gift was so significant, if we add up things like their property tax or mortgage interest, and now this huge charitable gift, they're definitely exceeding that almost $26,000 standard deduction amount. That's ultimately giving them about a $14,000 reduction in tax. It's a huge, huge savings. They just kept going the way that they were and giving $5,000 a year away to charity. They're not receiving any tax benefit, period. Okay, unless the tax code significantly changes. From there, they can direct $5,000 each and every year to a donor advised fund, which we'll touch on here in just a second, or to charities each and every year for the next 10 years. All right. So the nice thing about our donor advised fund let's just look at that right now, is a donor advised fund in and of itself is a charitable organization. It's a 501c3. Okay. So when you give money to the donor advised fund, you immediately receive the tax deduction, but you're not forced to dole those funds out all at once. You could do it over the course of 10 years. So in that previous example, clients were ultimately giving away $5,000 each and every year. All we did was put 10 years worth of gifts into the donor advised fund. They can still give that $5,000 away each and every year, just like they were before, but doing it all at once gave them a significant tax break in the last year that they're going to have high income. When you make a gift to the donor advised fund, it is irrevocable. You cannot undo it. As I mentioned earlier, in a perfect world, if you have a significant after-tax investment account, you're facilitating this gift by giving appreciated stock. So if you bought Ford stock, let's say, at $3 a share back in 2008 when we were going through the financial crisis, and you've owned it all the way until now, and currently it's right around $15 a share, you have a pretty significant unrealized capital gain, where if you sold that Ford stock, you're going to have to pay some taxes. Well, in this situation, you could give that Ford stock directly to a charity or to the donor advised fund. Your tax deduction is the fair market value of wherever that stock price was on that day of the gift, and you completely avoid any sort of tax or capital gains that you had on that particular position that you gifted. So I could talk to everyone for 30 minutes on how great these are, the donor advised fund, and being strategic with the way that you give. And I don't want to make this all about the financial aspects, but the reality is, like I mentioned earlier, if you can be smart and intelligent and thoughtful and intentional, I know that's like 4 different characteristics or adjectives to describe how effective this is, but at the end of the day, if we can be intentional with it, then we can end up hopefully saving you a lot of money when it comes to tax time by just doing it the right way. Okay. Roth IRA conversions. Now, if you're in the last year of working, or this is not, and then you ultimately retire, you might be in a slightly lower tax bracket. Roth IRA conversions could be a good opportunity to take a look at. Or if you get laid off from work in January and you don't ultimately find gainful employment until later on in the year, this year, let's say, could be a very anomaly sort of situation where your income is significantly lower, and you went from maybe being in the 24% tax bracket all the way down to the 10% tax bracket. Now, Roth IRA conversions, what does that mean? Why did these even come up, and how could they ultimately become effective in these anomaly years where you're in this very low tax bracket? When we convert money from a pre-tax IRA or 401k over to a Roth IRA, any money that comes out of that out of that pre-tax IRA or 401k, and we move it and drop it into a Roth, any amount is going to be totally taxable to you. So if you move $50,000 out of a traditional pre-tax IRA, you want to convert that to a Roth, $50,000 shows up as income on your tax return. There's no 10% early withdrawal penalty, but that $50,000 counts as ordinary income. So when you're in a very low tax bracket year, that is not the norm. In many cases, it could actually make sense to accelerate some income and take advantage of that situation. If we know at some point we're going to need to take money out of your IRA anyways, why not try to do so when you're in a low bracket and when we're in these historically low tax environment that we're in, that ironically is actually going to sunset at the end of 2025. Once again, a whole separate topic. Could probably spend another 30 minutes talking about our current tax code and how that's going to change over the next several years. So bottom line, really interesting and compelling opportunity to take a look at. Roth IRAs, why would we ever want to do this? What's the benefit? When you have money in a Roth IRA, the funds grow totally tax-free. Assuming that you take the position, or you take the distributions out after age 59 and a half, anything that you take out is going to be totally tax and penalty free. I'm a big fan of diversifying your investment portfolio as well as the types of investment accounts that you own. Okay. So if you have everything in a pre-tax 401k, like many clients do, because that's the best place for you to save when you're working, it can create some challenges later on when you're going to take the money out in retirement. Now, it doesn't mean that every single person out there needs a Roth IRA, but in a lot of situations, in our experience, having that Roth IRA gives clients flexibility to be able to draw from different accounts that have different tax treatments ultimately when you do retire. When we're trying to create that tax efficient paycheck for you when you're no longer working. Okay. One of the other benefits that I'll close with, we have this new inherited IRA rule that went into effect in the year 2020. So previously, if you were a non-spouse beneficiary, so let's say I inherited an IRA or a Roth IRA from my mom, okay? I would be able to ultimately take a little bit out of each of those accounts each and every year until the day that I pass away. Okay, those are called required minimum distributions, and I could quote unquote stretch those over the course of my entire lifetime. Well, we now have this 10-year rule, which basically says you have 10 years to ultimately deplete those accounts. Doesn't mean that you need to take out the same exact amount each and every year to satisfy those required minimum distributions, but you need to, in most cases, take out something. Okay, there's still a little bit of gray area there with the IRS that we're trying to get some clarity on how much exactly you need to take out each and every year. Can it be nothing one year? Can it all be at once in year 10? Those are extreme examples, but point being, you can no longer stretch those distributions out over your entire lifetime. And so if you think about it, if you're inheriting a traditional or pre-tax IRA, the amount that is going to hit your tax return is going to be condensed even more, right? So if you have $1 million IRA that you're ultimately inheriting, in theory, you're going to take out $100 grand a year to make sure that that account is depleted within 10 years. And that's a very simplified example that doesn't take any consideration with market fluctuations or things of that nature, but hopefully that makes sense, right? So if you're the one inheriting that money, ultimately that's a significant increase to your income level. So when you have money in the Roth IRA, it's still subject to that 10-year rule when you inherit the funds, but it's not considered taxable income. So it's a great way to help position the next generation in a more tax efficient manner. There's a lot of nuances here, but this is where we spend a tremendous amount of time with clients to really help them not only think about their financial plan, but the next generation as well on who's going to be managing and ultimately going to be receiving the wealth that you've worked very hard for over the years. One thing that we see frequently, especially in the Metro Detroit area with the big three, if you've been laid off or if you're going to be retiring, what do I do if I have a pension? Okay. In a lot of situations and circumstances, you will have the decision, do I want to take a lump sum or do I want to ultimately receive a set monthly payment each and every month that's guaranteed for my entire life? And for if you're married, for a spouse's life as well, potentially, okay? Survivor benefits and things like that, we would also want to take a look at. But it's a big time decision and you get one shot at it to make sure that you make the right one. I will say in a low interest rate environment, lump sum distributions tend to be fairly attractive. So I would say, over the last 10 years, especially with rates being as low as they've been, lump sums and how much a pension plan is going to offer you to ultimately take that money, move it into an IRA or another retirement plan to manage on your own. And you're responsible for making that money grow and to make sure that you're ultimately creating your own paycheck to a large extent, you or your advisor or coordination between the two, right? In the low rate environment, those lump sum distributions tend to be more attractive. Now, as rates have gone up, we've actually seen situations with clients where there's been $100,000, $200,000 swing in the pension lump sum compared to the previous year because rates have started to tick up, given the moves that the Federal Reserve has taken over the course of the year so far. So interest rates, huge impact on how much you would be looking at with the lump sum compared to the monthly payment. Each and every company values has a different valuation date. So that might be something to look at. I can think of an example with a client where, at the next valuation date of the pension was going to be later on in the year. If this particular individual retired now, their lump sum would have been $200,000 or $300,000 more. So they decided to retire now, as opposed to waiting until later on in the year, potentially January of 2023 to walk away. In many cases, you don't have that luxury. This webinar is focused on being laid off and some of the decisions, but in many cases, being laid off and retirement can come hand in hand. So when do I retain the monthly payment amount or the monthly annuity? If you have longevity in your family, if you just really want to make darn sure that no matter what, you're receiving that monthly payment, it's not subject to the market fluctuating, that could be a really good option for you. Always want to make sure, and this is, I would say, one of the most important things and that we want to look at, hands down, is to make sure that if you do decide or are leaning more towards the monthly pension option, that your pension is protected by the PBGC, okay? The Pension Benefit Guaranty Corporation, which basically is what I like to describe as the FDIC insurance for pensions. And FDIC insurance, if you remember, is essentially that backstop that banks have, where if the bank went under that you work with, your accounts are protected up to $250,000. It's the same sort of thing with pensions. Not every pension plan is covered. So if the pension went bankrupt, your payment could be dramatically reduced or even go away completely. So most of your larger companies are all covered, but some are not. And there's a lot of different forms of pension, of the pension plan as well. It's very complicated. So it's one thing that we do a deep dive on, especially if the client is really leaning towards doing the monthly payment, to make sure, God forbid, something ever happened with the actual company, it went under, that your payment is not going to be jeopardized, because that could ruin someone's retirement. We've seen it before. Unfortunately, we'll see it happen again. So those are things that we really want to take a look at to make sure that you're making an informed decision. As we switch gears here a little bit more towards investments, if you've been laid off, one of the biggest things that I would encourage you to do, whether you're within a year or two of retirement or not, is to take a really close look at your asset allocation. How much in stocks and bonds do you ultimately have in your portfolio? What does that mix look like? Because if you ultimately need to take money out of your portfolio to get you through a period of time because of this layoff, or you're going to end up retiring and you're going to need money out of your portfolio to supplement your spending, the market's volatile each and every year. This is one of my most favorite charts that JP Morgan puts together every quarter. It shows how much variability in returns the S&P 500, our largest index that we track for US stocks, can be each and every year. And we're seeing that, case in point in 2022. On average, the S&P 500 goes down about 14% each and every year. Okay. And I know it's kind of hard to think of, because over the last 10 or 12 years, with the exception of 2022 and 2020 with COVID, it's been a nice little straight line up, and it doesn't always feel like we've had that volatility. But 2018, we were down about 20% at one point, and looking back at those situations, it's kind of a blip on the radar. But point being, the market does this each and every year, and so despite that intra-year pullback, however, the market still ends positive about 75% of the time. So we want to make sure that your asset allocation and how much that you have in stocks and bonds and cash is appropriate for your life situation, for your risk tolerance, for the goals that you have, et cetera. And I bring that up because the market's going to do what the market does. So we need to make sure that we build out a portfolio that's going to get you through those times. I alluded to it earlier, but now is the time to really take a look at your spending with, really underneath a microscope, I should say, really making sure that the money is going where you want it to be, that you're spending intentionally. Is there an opportunity to ultimately cut some things out? So whether we're backing into things for a retirement spending goal, or if you've just been laid off and you're really trying to take a look on, how much is going to be coming in versus how much is going out, if you ultimately are receiving a severance, things of that nature, it's a very, very important exercise. If you have received notice that you're being laid off and this is the trigger for you to ultimately retire, this is something that we go through with clients frequently. And this is, I'll be honest, nothing overly fancy. It's really not, but we really just want to start with how much are you making right now? How much is going out that's not going to be there anymore in terms of expenses? And from there, we should pretty comfortably have an idea of how much a client is spending. That's going to be one of the most important figures that we spend time on, or that we're doing analysis around, to make sure that you can spend what you want to spend in retirement, but never have to worry about making a significant adjustment to your spending or changing your lifestyle. So let's look at an example here where a client couple is making $175,000 a year, but between things like their 401k savings, helping a child or grandchild out with college savings, whether that's paying, funds directly to an institution to cover tuition, or saving money into an education account like a 529 plan, $10,000 a year. And then we have things like federal, state, local tax, as well as some payroll tax with Social Security and Medicare. It's another 43,000 between the two of them. So it's astonishing. You can quickly crunch the numbers here. It's not that much more than about half of the total amount that the client is actually living on, right? So 96,000, or the gross amount's 175. Clients actually living on an amount closer to 96,000 or $8,000 a month in net spending. So this is a good starting place. Like I mentioned earlier, we don't want clients to have to dramatically sacrifice or change the lifestyle that they have when they're retired. If that is the situation, in my experience, clients will just simply work a little bit longer to put their financial plan in place, or in a position, I should say, where they are able to do that. And even if you've been laid off and this has been kind of forced upon you, maybe it means working a little bit longer, but retiring from working full time, which I'll talk a little bit more about here in a few minutes. But if we assume a 20% tax rate between federal and state on that 96 grand, the total gross amount that we need to help recreate for this client in retirement is closer to about 120,000, because we're always going to have some form of tax in retirement, but different sort of tax, and generally speaking, significantly lower compared to what you're paying when you're working. Okay. I know that's a very simplified example here, but from there, what we do is we say, okay, here's the gross goal, or what the gross spending amount is going to have to be to get Mr. and Mrs. Client the net spending goal that they want to live on in retirement. So from there, we're going to take a look at fixed income sources like Social Security and pension and things like that. And also, very importantly, take a look at what they've been able to accumulate in their portfolio, savings over the years. The other, leg of the stool, if you will, is going to be potentially part-time work. And I'm seeing a big time trend, and I'll talk about more about this, I should say, here in a second, where more and more clients just want to retire from working full-time. They're open to, working part-time on something that brings a little bit more meaning and fulfillment to their lives. If this is the trigger, you've been laid off, and it's the trigger to really consider retiring, or to speed that process up a little bit, or at least retire from working full-time, we want to be really cognizant and aware of the sequence of return or timing risk, which basically means having not so great market performance in what I like to call the retirement red zone, which is, the 2 to 3 years leading up to retirement and the 2 to 3 years into retirement. Okay. We can't control what the market's doing. I had several clients that, thinking back in, mid 2019, talking about retirement plans for January of 2020. Clients retired in January 2020, and then we had this pandemic breakout, and the market went down 35% in 2 weeks. We planned before that. How do we position their asset allocation, their portfolio, to be a little bit more conservative for the next couple of years, have a little bit more in cash to get them the funds that they need each and every month, maybe implements, certain sort of investments to reduce risk in the portfolio. We're not trying to time the market, but we're just trying to reduce risk during that time frame. Because if you have to sell a lot of the more, I'll say, aggressive or growth-oriented positions in your portfolio when the market is not doing so great, that can wreak havoc on your plan. So it doesn't mean that we never sell securities when the market's down to get cash. We need to do that to get you the cash flow that you want to live on. That being said, it's about what do we sell and how do we plan to make sure that your cash reserves are constantly being replenished. And we do this in a very intentional and thoughtful way to help mitigate this retirement red zone risk as much as we can. We're never going to completely get rid of it, but making your accounts a little bit more conservative for a couple of years, even if that means we lose out a little bit on the upside. In my opinion, there's too much at stake to get this wrong in the first couple of years of retirement. Having fixed income like an annuity and a pension, part-time work, all those things help to reduce the sequence of return risk because we're not having to rely on your portfolio quite as much. So wrapping up here, I thought I would talk just a few minutes about the whole concept of retiring from working full time. You've heard me say this a couple times throughout the presentation today. I'm becoming more and more passionate about this topic because of how powerful I've seen it ultimately be in clients' lives and how big of a positive impact it has had. I've sat down with couples over the last couple of years or so where, they've really rethought, what does retirement look like? What do they want to do in life? What are the things that really provide them joy, meaning, and fulfillment? What do they want to accomplish in retirement or this next phase of life? If you've received news that you're being laid off, like I said in the very beginning, it's an opportunity to pause and take a breath. What do I really want to do? What is my life going to look like from here? And one of the really cool shifts that I've started to see is the concept of no longer working 40, 50, 60 hours a week, but being open to working, let's say 15 to 25, or maybe even 30 hours a week. I'd say any more than 30, you're still kind of in that near full-time work role. I challenge clients to say, I hear you, but in certain situations where clients tell me they're going to work 30-ish hours a week, I start to question it a little bit and say, well, you're saying you're just going to work part-time, but it's actually a full-time job. And that's just me kind of being that professional accountability partner, devil's advocate in those conversations. But, folks get burnt after a while. If you're in your early 60s, chances are that you've worked for 4 decades or more in the labor force. And it takes a toll after a while. And many of the clients that we work with earned a good living over the years. They've worked in positions that are stressful, that take a lot out of you mentally and sometimes physically. And you get to a place, maybe you have grandkids or your life has changed dramatically, or your passions or your interests has changed. And you look at your financial plan, you say, this thing's in pretty good shape. Can I afford to just do a hard stop? Maybe not. But if I work the next 2 or 3 years and make even a third or half of what I was earning, working full time, I can actually do something that I enjoy a little bit more. I might not be able to save as much or anything into my 401k over the next couple of years, but if it means that you're not having to draw money out of the portfolio as soon or as much as soon, if that makes sense, take as much money out of the portfolio as early on, which also has an impact on that sequence of return risk, it's astonishing how big of an impact working and having some part-time income can actually have on the portfolio and the overall sustainability of your financial plan. So it's really interesting because the National Bureau of Economic Research came out with a research paper a couple of years ago called The Power of Working Longer. And so what they basically did was try to see, okay, and quantify the impact of working a little bit longer. Well, like I said, doesn't have to mean working full time longer. So some pretty incredible stats that I thought I would share with everyone joining. Saving 1% more towards retirement for the final 10 years of your career has the same impact as working how many more months longer? Now, if this was a live session and I was doing this in front of a group of 15 or 20, I might throw a prize out there. Hey, throw some numbers at you. It's a little bit different today on the webinar, but so not a whole lot of suspense here, but it's a whopping 1 month longer. So let me just restate that so it sinks in. So saving 1% more towards retirement for the final 10 years of your career has the same impact as only working 1 month longer. So you get to a point in your career where sure, saving more money in your 401k plan and your investment portfolio. As a financial advisor, I'm never going to tell you that's a bad thing. But the reality is when you hit a tipping point a little bit later on in your career, the extra savings doesn't move the needle all that much. It helps, but it's not making a meaningful difference over the course of a 20, 30-year retirement time horizon in most cases. What does is reducing the amount that you're taking out of your portfolio. Not saying you got to completely fill that gap with earned income, but at least reducing it actually has a far greater impact in a positive way on your financial plan. Making the or extending the example out even more, so saving 1% more towards retirement over the course of 30 years has shown to have the same impact as working 3.5 months longer. It's insane to me. Basically, what this is saying is you could have a choice of either saving 9 or 10% into your retirement. If you choose to only save 9 instead of 10, you only need to work 3.5 months longer than the person who saved 10 to end up in the same place. It's astonishing when you look at the numbers. So like I said, I'm really seeing a positive trend in direction here, where more and more individuals are open to this. They're taking advantage of phased retirement programs with their employers, and they're doing things that they've really never thought that they would do, or maybe working hours now that allow them to still see the kids or the grandkids or babysit grandkids a little bit more, et cetera. Everyone's situation is unique, but has had a really positive impact on many of the clients that we have the privilege of serving. So in conclusion, I would ask you, what is your strategy? What is your strategy from here? Whether it's this next phase of life, if you're still going to keep working, where this is simply a career transition, or if you've taken this situation of being laid off or separating from service and ultimately saying, you know what, this is the time, I am going to retire. What is my strategy from here? And I show a photo of Mount Everest, and I love it. It says, don't let the trip of a lifetime turn into a nightmare. The reality is most of the clients that we work with, that we serve, did this on their own for a large part of their career. And then they hit a tipping point, or they hit a life event, whether it's being laid off or retirement or a divorce or a spouse passing away or an inheritance, whatever it may be. And it's that trigger point where there's a lot of decisions that need to be made because of that life event. Or you get to this place where you say, you know what, I've done really good on my own. I haven't stepped on any landmines, but I need this money to last me the next 30 or 40 years. And I want someone along my side along this journey to make sure that I don't blow this up, that I get this right, through all the twists and turns that life is going to bring us. So I love this quote. Unfortunately, Eric Arnold was a climber of Mount Everest who sadly passed away after his third or fourth attempt at climbing Mount Everest. He said he was ultimately interviewed by a media outlet, I believe only about 4 to 6 months before he tragically passed away on one of his climbs. But he said 2/3 of the accidents happen on the way down. If you get euphoric and think, I have reached my goal, the most dangerous part is still ahead of you. So I'll close with that, because this is what we do best, in our opinion. We're helping clients through transitions, making sure that you have the retirement that you want. You're able to spend the time on things that, like I said, bring you joy, meaning, and fulfillment, and work with a partner that you trust. You're engaged in the process, but you don't have to worry about the financial things anymore. You allow us to make sure that your portfolio is allocated properly, keeping up with tax law changes, et cetera, et cetera. Next step. So if you have questions or you would like additional resources, please, we're here to help. Whether it's myself or my other colleagues, lead financial planners here, we just want to help to educate and be a resource during this challenging time for you. Feel free to reach out. My email is below, phone number 248-948-7900. We're going to send some additional emails out to help ultimately make sure that you have the information that you need as you're going through this transition. If you want to set up a time to chat, to go into specific questions, we're here to be a resource, like I said. So thank you again so much for attending. And I hope you all have a wonderful day. And once again, please feel free to reach out. We're here to be of help with you.